Grief is supposed to be a heavy thing, a weight that pins you to the mattress until the sun gives up and goes home. But after 40 years with Elias, my grief wasn't heavy. It was thin. It was a translucent film over my eyes that made the world look slightly out of focus. It had been 6 months since I buried him in his best charcoal suit, the one I pressed myself while the radiator hissed in the hallway, and yet I still found myself shopping for two. I suppose habits are the only ghosts that truly haunt us. I was in the spice aisle of the Walmart on 86th Street, debating between the generic paprika and the brand name that Elias always insisted tasted more like real smoke. It was a Tuesday, 10:45 a.m. The air smelled of floor wax and industrial cooling. That was when I heard it. A sound so specific, so deeply etched into the grooves of my brain that my heart didn't just skip. It stopped. It was a laugh. Low, melodic, with a slight gravelly catch at the very end, the sound Elias made whenever he thought he'd gotten away with something small, like sneaking a piece of bacon off my plate. I froze. My hand, still hovering over the paprika, began to tremble. I am 65 years old. I am a woman of logic, of hymns, and of measured reactions. I do not believe in the supernatural, and I certainly do not believe in resurrection between the condiments and the baking supplies. But that laugh was an inheritance I wasn't ready to spend. I turned my head, slowly, my neck popping with the effort of suppressed breath. At the far end of the aisle, near the bulk flour, a man was disappearing around the corner. He wore a tan Harrington jacket. Elias had one exactly like it, with a small grease stain on the left cuff from a Sunday morning in 1998. The height was right. The slope of the shoulders, weighted by decades of hard work and hidden thoughts, was identical. I didn't call out. I didn't scream. That is the mistake younger women make. They let their lungs do the work that their feet should be doing. I moved. I pushed my cart forward, the wheels squeaking a rhythmic protest against the linoleum. My mind was a whirlwind of impossibilities. I had seen the casket close. I had felt the coldness of his hand. I had cashed the life insurance check that now sat, untouched and mocking, in a high-yield savings account. When I reached the end of the aisle and peered around the metal shelving, the man in the tan jacket was standing by a display of seasonal candles. He wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a woman. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp, cream-colored wool coat that looked entirely too expensive for a Tuesday morning at Walmart. She was smiling, her hand resting familiarly on his arm. Then he turned his profile to me. The profile was a lie. It wasn't Elias. This man was younger, perhaps 40, but the resemblance was a physical assault. He had Elias's nose, that distinct regal bridge, and the same deep-set, intelligent eyes that had once looked at me with what I thought was unwavering devotion. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind the woman's ear, a gesture so tender it felt like a needle under my fingernail. "We should get the lavender," the man said. His voice was a younger, fresher version of the ghost I'd been mourning. "It reminds me of the garden back home." "Which home, Solomon?" the woman asked, her voice dripping with a playful, sharp sweetness. "The one you tell people about, or the one you actually keep?" They shared a look, a private, knowing glance that contained 1,000 secrets I wasn't invited to. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. I realized then that the man didn't just look like Elias. He looked like the version of Elias that would have existed if Elias had ever been truly happy. I stepped back into the shadows of the shelving, my mind weaving threads I hadn't known were loose. Solomon, a biblical name, a name for a man who divides things in half. I watched them walk toward the registers, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. I felt a coldness settling in my marrow that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I had spent 40 years building a life on a foundation I assumed was solid stone. But standing there, clutching a jar of smoked paprika, I realized I had been living in a house of cards, and someone had just opened the door to a very cold draft. I didn't leave. I followed them to the parking lot. I needed to see the car. I needed to see where Solomon went when the sun was high. As I watched them load bags into a silver Lexus, a car Elias always said was too flashy for decent folks, I felt a strange, quiet shift inside me. The grief was gone. In its place was something much older, much sharper. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the license plate. My hands were perfectly still now. Before I tell you what I found when I tracked that plate to a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, only 20 minutes from the house, I shared with Elias, I have to ask you something. Have you ever looked at a photograph of your life and realized there was someone standing in the background of every single frame, watching you wait for a man who wasn't really there? Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever felt like your intuition was screaming a truth your heart wasn't ready to hear. The drive to the address linked to the silver Lexus took exactly 22 minutes. I know this because I timed it against the ticking of the dashboard clock. A steady, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. 22 minutes. For 40 years, I believed my world ended at the edge of our driveway on Elm Street. I didn't realize that another world, one built with my husband's bricks and mortar, existed just 3 zip codes away. The neighborhood was the kind of place where the grass is trimmed with surgical precision and the silence feels expensive. No children played in the street. No neighbors leaned over fences to trade gossip about the local church choir. It was a place for people who valued privacy over community. I pulled my aging sedan into a spot 2 houses down, tucking myself behind a large, weeping willow that offered a screen of drooping green. Number 412. It was a colonial-style house, painted a pristine white with shutters the color of a summer sky. It looked nothing like the brick bungalow Elias and I had shared, with its peeling porch paint and the stubborn moss in the cracks of the walkway. This house was cared for by professional hands. A landscaping truck was parked in the driveway, 2 men in neon vests blowing stray leaves away from a rose garden that looked far too vibrant for the season. I sat there for an hour. I am a patient woman. I've spent 40 years waiting for dinners to finish, for laundry to dry, and for a husband to come home from late shifts at the rail yard. I know how to sit with my own thoughts until they become as sharp as a paring knife. At 12:15 p.m., the front door opened. The woman from the store, the one in the cream coat, stepped out onto the porch. She had changed into a silk wrap dress, the deep emerald green contrasting beautifully with her mahogany skin. She looked radiant. She looked like a woman who didn't know the meaning of the word budget. She walked to the edge of the porch and called out toward the backyard. Solomon, the caterers just called. They'll be here by 5. A moment later, the man appeared from around the side of the house. He was wiping his hands on a rag, his gait relaxed, his expression light. Seeing him again in the daylight, without the flickering fluorescent hum of Walmart, the resemblance to Elias was even more haunting. He wasn't Elias's ghost. He was Elias's legacy. Don't worry, Elena, he shouted back. The patio is ready. Everything will be perfect for the anniversary. Anniversary. The word hit me like a physical blow. Elias and I would have celebrated our 41st anniversary next month. I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I watched as Solomon walked up to Elena and kissed her on the forehead, not the chaste, habitual kiss Elias used to give me before leaving for work, but a lingering, appreciative gesture. I began to put the pieces together, the logic of a lifetime of bookkeeping taking over. Elias had been a foreman at the rail yard for 35 years. He was a man of modest means, or so he told me. We lived simply. We saved. We didn't take vacations to the islands or buy luxury cars. Yet, here was a man who looked like his twin, living in a house that cost 3 times ours, talking about caterers and anniversaries. I reached into my glove box and pulled out the small leather-bound notebook I always keep for grocery lists and prayer requests. I began to write. I noted the time, the description of the woman, the name of the catering company on the side of the truck that pulled up 10 minutes later, Gilded Spoon Events. I realized then that I wasn't just looking at a secret family. I was looking at a financial miracle. Money doesn't manifest out of thin air, especially not the kind of money required to maintain a life like this. Elias had been a man of many silences, and I had always respected them, thinking they were the quiet reflections of a hard-working man. Now I saw them for what they were, walls. I waited until Solomon and Elena went back inside before I put my car in gear. I didn't feel the urge to confront them. A confrontation is a loud, messy thing that gives the guilty a chance to lie. No, I wanted the truth, and the truth is usually buried in the paper trail. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked different. The film of grief had completely burned away, leaving something cold and predatory underneath. I was no longer a widow mourning a loss. I was an investigator auditing a fraud. I headed toward the one place I knew Elias kept his private things, a small safety deposit box at the downtown bank he told me was for emergency deeds and burial instructions. He'd given me the key years ago, tucked into the back of our wedding album, telling me only to open it if he didn't come home one day. Well, Elias, I thought as I gripped the steering wheel, you didn't come home. And I think it's time I saw what you were so keen on burying. I parked the car and walked into the bank, the marble floors echoing under my sensible shoes. The teller smiled at me, a young girl who saw only a sweet grandmother in a floral blouse. She had no idea she was looking at a woman about to dismantle a dead man's altar. The bank vault was subterranean, a cold, windowless room lined with dull brass doors. It felt like a tomb, which was fitting, I suppose. The air was thin and carried the faint metallic scent of old coins and recycled oxygen. I sat in a small, private cubicle, the heavy metal box resting on the table before me like a silent witness. My hands did not shake as I turned the key. I have spent my life folding laundry, kneading bread, and smoothing over the rough edges of a marriage. I know how to handle delicate things. When the lid clicked open, I didn't find jewelry or sentimental letters. I found a stack of ledgers bound in cracked black leather and a series of heavy manila envelopes. At the very top was a birth certificate. Solomon Elias Monroe, born 38 years ago. Father, Elias Monroe. Mother, Martha Jean Sinclair. The name hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Martha Jean. I remembered her. She had been a secretary at the rail yard back in the late 70s. A quiet woman with wide eyes who had moved away for family reasons around the same time Elias had taken those extra double shifts to save for our future. The future he was saving for, it seemed, wasn't mine. I turned the pages of the first ledger. It was a meticulous record of a double life. Elias hadn't just been a foreman. He had been a ghost consultant for a logistics firm I'd never heard of. Payments, large 5-figure sums, had been funneled through a shell corporation called VV Holdings. Looking at the dates, I realized that every time we sacrificed a vacation or I mended a coat for the third winter in a row, a wire transfer was being made to an account in Solomon's name. The betrayal wasn't just the child. It was the sustained daily theft of our shared life. He had played the part of the struggling, hard-working black man to perfection, coming home with grease on his knuckles and fatigue in his eyes, while blocks away, he was building a kingdom for a son I never knew existed. I pulled out a series of deeds. The house with the blue shutters, a vacation property in Sedona, a small retail plaza on the north side, all owned by VV Holdings. all managed by Solomon. I felt a strange, detached clarity. If Elias were alive, I might have screamed. I might have thrown the heavy brass lamp at the wall. But Elias was in the ground, and dead men don't feel the sting of a woman's fury. They only leave behind messes for the living to clean up. I looked at the totals in the ledger. Millions. Over 4 decades, Elias had diverted a fortune away from our household. I realized then that Solomon and Elena weren't just living a secret life. They were living on my inheritance. Every brick of that colonial house was paid for with the Over time, Elias claimed he was working while I sat home alone, keeping his dinner warm in the oven. I reached the bottom of the box and found a small, velvet-lined case. Inside was a set of cufflinks, gold, engraved with the initials SEV. There was also a note written in Elias's cramped, familiar hand. To my son, carry the name with pride. What I built in the dark will one day be your light. The arrogance of it made my skin crawl. He thought he was a kingmaker. He thought he could bury a whole life in the shadows, and it would stay there. He forgot that the sun eventually sets on every kingdom, and the shadows are where I've lived for 40 years. I know the terrain of the dark better than he ever did. I didn't take the money. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. Lawyers are loud. Lawyers give the other side time to prepare a defense. No, I took the ledgers and the deeds to the local library and spent 3 hours at the photocopier. I made 3 copies of everything. One for my safe, one for a locker I rented across town, and one for a very specific person I had identified in the ledgers, a man named Leroy Monroe. He was listed as the trustee for VV Holdings. He was also, according to a quick search on the library computer, a man currently under investigation for tax evasion in a completely unrelated case. I sat back and watched the green light of the copier slide back and forth, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. Solomon thought he was the rightful heir to a secret fortune. He didn't realize that a foundation built on lies is nothing but sand. And I was about to start the rain. I tucked the originals back into the safety deposit box and walked out of the bank. The sun was bright, blindingly so. I put on my oversized sunglasses and adjusted my hat. I looked like any other widow going about her business. But as I walked toward my car, I wasn't thinking about the past. I was thinking about the anniversary party at the house with the blue shutters. I was thinking about the caterer's gilded spoon events. And I was thinking about how easy it is to ruin a perfect evening with just one well-placed guest. The library was quiet, but my mind was loud. As I sat at the mahogany table, the smell of old paper and digital ozone surrounding me, I began to map out the geography of Solomon's life. It wasn't enough to know he existed. I needed to know what he valued. Men like Elias. And I suspected men like the son he'd polished in his own image don't just care about money. They care about standing. They care about the way the world bows when they enter a room. I looked at the social media pages for Elena, the woman in the cream coat. Her life was a curated gallery of blessings. Photos of the Sedona house, the silver Lexus, and a series of charitable galas for the Monroe Foundation. It was a clever touch, using my last name to mask a history of theft. They weren't just living on Elias's money. They were wearing his respectability like a stolen garment. Then I found it, the invitation. Elena had posted a digital flyer for the Monroe Sinclair 10th anniversary celebration. It wasn't just a party, it was a fundraiser for their foundation. The guest list was a who's who of local developers, city council members, and the very same Leroy Monroe I'd found in the ledgers. They were holding the event this coming Saturday, 3 days from now. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of a woman who had spent 40 years being the helpmate. I had scrubbed Elias's floors, ironed his shirts, and kept his secrets because I thought they were our secrets. I had been the silent partner in a firm that was embezzling my own life. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Gilded Spoon Events. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice slipping into the polite, slightly fragile tone of an elderly woman who is easily confused. "I'm calling regarding the Monroe Sinclair event this Saturday. I'm a distant relative of Solomon's, and I wanted to ensure my dietary restrictions were noted. My name is Mrs. Elias Monroe." There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the rustle of papers, the clicking of a keyboard. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the young man said, his voice hesitant. "I don't see a Mrs. Elias Monroe on the VIP list. I have a Martha Sinclair as the matriarch." "Oh, dear," I sighed, letting a tremor enter my breath. "There must be a mistake. Solomon would be heartbroken. I'm his father's primary beneficiary. Perhaps I should call him directly?" No, ma'am, don't worry," he said quickly, likely terrified of upsetting a wealthy client's relative. "I can add you to the service staff's guest log for entry. We have you down for the garden seating at 7 p.m. Any allergies?" "Only to lies," I whispered, though not loud enough for him to hear. "Just a simple gluten-free plate will do, dear." "Thank you." I hung up. I had my way in. I wasn't going to storm the gates. I was going to walk through them with a polite smile and a handbag full of lightning. I spent the rest of the afternoon at a high-end consignment shop 3 towns over. I didn't want to be recognized by anyone who might have seen me at the bank or the grocery store. I found a vintage Chanel suit in navy blue, the color of authority. It fit me like armor. When I looked in the 3-way mirror, I didn't see the grieving widow. I saw a woman who was about to perform a long overdue audit. I went home and sat in Elias's favorite armchair. It still smelled faintly of his tobacco and the peppermint he chewed to hide the scent. I realized then that I wasn't just angry at the woman or the son. I was angry at the silence I had allowed to grow between us. I had mistaken his distance for dignity. I had mistaken his absence for hard work. I pulled out the photocopy of the ledger and turned to the last page Elias had written before he died. It was a list of assets to be transferred to Solomon upon the event. That's what he called his own death. The event. He hadn't left me the house. He hadn't left me the savings. He had left me a life insurance policy and a lifetime of thank yous that were actually goodbyes. I picked up a pen and began to draft a letter. It wasn't to Solomon. It was to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, specifically to the agent handling Leroy Monroe's file. I didn't mail it. Not yet. A letter is a cold thing. I wanted them to see the look on Leroy's face when he realized his trusty Judy's were about to become a federal liability. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea, stirring it slowly. The clink of the spoon against the porcelain was the only sound in the house. It was a lonely sound, but for the first time in months, I didn't mind the quiet. The quiet was where I did my best work. The next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't just the silence of a widow. It was the quiet of a strategist. I spent the early hours in Elias's wood-paneled study, a room I had always entered with a certain reverence, as if my presence might disturb the heavy lifting of his mind. I realized now that the only thing he was lifting in here was the wool over my eyes. I sat at his desk, running my fingers over the mahogany. I found the false bottom in the lower right drawer, a cliché Elias probably thought was brilliant. Inside wasn't more money. It was a burner phone and a small, leather-bound address book. I flipped through the pages. Most names were encrypted with shorthand, but one stood out. Yes, Leroy Monroe. Beside, it was a string of numbers that didn't look like a phone number. It looked like an account routing code. I pulled up my laptop. Over the last decade, I'd learned more about digital footprints than Elias ever gave me credit for. I wasn't just a wife. I was the one who managed our household's transition to online banking while he grumbled about the old ways. He thought I was just clicking buttons. He didn't realize I was learning the architecture of the system he was using to rob me. I traced the routing code. It led to a private offshore entity in the Cayman Islands, linked back to VV Holdings. But here was the crack in his armor. The account required a secondary physical authorization for any transfer over $50,000. An authorization that, according to the bank's security protocol, had been sent to our home address for 40 years. I went to the hallway closet to the junk drawer where I kept unfiled mail and old catalogs. I dug deep past the church bulletins and the utility bills. There, tucked inside a 2023 Sears catalog Elias had insisted on keeping, was a small black plastic device, a security token. He had hidden it in plain sight, trusting that I would never look past the surface of our mundane life. He thought my lack of curiosity was a character trait. He didn't realize it was a choice, one I was now rescinding. I pressed the button on the token. 6 digits flickered to life in a ghostly green glow. I logged into the VV Holdings portal using the credentials I'd pieced together from his ledger. The screen bathed my face in blue light as the balance appeared. $4.8 million. This wasn't just overtime money. This was the result of decades of kickbacks, diverted pension funds, and the systematic draining of the rail yard's maintenance budget. Elias hadn't just been a cheater. He had been a thief on a grand scale. And Solomon, the successful son, was the laundry machine. I looked at the transaction history. Every month, a consulting fee was paid out to SEV Enterprises, Solomon's company. It was enough to pay for the silver Lexus, the colonial house, and the emerald green silk dresses. It was enough to buy a life that looked perfect from the sidewalk. But money like that leaves a scent. I looked at the most recent outgoing wires. Leroy Monroe had been taking a 20% management fee. No wonder he was under investigation. He wasn't just a trustee. He was a parasite. I felt a cold, sharp prickle of satisfaction. Solomon thought he was the master of this inheritance. He didn't realize that as the legal widow of Elias Monroe, I had a claim to every cent of community property that had been illegally diverted. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't just a guest at his party. I was the owner of the house he was standing in. I picked up the burner phone. There was one saved message, dated 2 days before Elias's heart finally gave out. It was Solomon's voice. "Pop, Leroy says the feds are sniffing around the rail yard contracts. We need to move the Vengeance file to the Sedona server. Call me when the coast is clear." Vengeance file, the name of my husband's secret ledgers, was a slur against the very life I'd given him. He viewed his double life as a reckoning, a way to get even with a world that made him work for a living. He didn't see the irony that the only person he actually defeated was the woman who loved him. I didn't delete the message. I forwarded it to my private email. Then I spent the afternoon drafting a very specific gift for the anniversary party. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me that Solomon's entire lifestyle was a house built on a sinkhole. I just needed to be the one to pull the plug. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the study, I realized I wasn't tired. For the first time in months, the weight in my chest was gone. I wasn't mourning a man anymore. I was preparing to meet a ghost. The next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't just the silence of a widow. It was the quiet of a strategist. I spent the early hours in Elias's wood-paneled study, a room I had always entered with a certain reverence, as if my presence might disturb the heavy lifting of his mind. I realized now that the only thing he was lifting in here was the wool over my eyes. I sat at his desk, running my fingers over the mahogany. I found the false bottom in the lower right drawer, a cliche Elias probably thought was brilliant. Inside wasn't more money. It was a burner phone and a small, leather-bound address book. I flipped through the pages. Most names were encrypted with shorthand, but one stood out. Yes, Leroy Monroe. Beside, it was a string of numbers that didn't look like a phone number. It looked like an account routing code. I pulled up my laptop. Over the last decade, I'd learned more about digital footprints than Elias ever gave me credit for. I wasn't just a wife. I was the one who managed our household's transition to online banking while he grumbled about the old ways. He thought I was just clicking buttons. He didn't realize I was learning the architecture of the system he was using to rob me. I traced the routing code. It led to a private offshore entity in the Cayman Islands, linked back to VV Holdings. But here was the crack in his armor. The account required a secondary physical authorization for any transfer over $50,000. An authorization that, according to the bank's security protocol, had been sent to our home address for 40 years. I went to the hallway closet, to the junk drawer where I kept unfiled mail and old catalogs. I dug deep past the church bulletins and the utility bills. There, tucked inside a 2023 Sears catalog Elias had insisted on keeping, was a small, black plastic device, a security token. He had hidden it in plain sight, trusting that I would never look past the surface of our mundane life. He thought my lack of curiosity was a character trait. He didn't realize it was a choice, one I was now rescinding. I pressed the button on the token. 6 digits flickered to life in a ghostly green glow. I logged into the VV Holdings portal using the credentials I'd pieced together from his ledger. The screen bathed my face in blue light as the balance appeared. $4.8 million. This wasn't just overtime money. This was the result of decades of kickbacks, diverted pension funds, and the systematic draining of the rail yard's maintenance budget. Elias hadn't just been a foreman. He had been a thief on a grand scale. And Solomon, the successful son, was the laundry machine. I looked at the transaction history. Every month, a consulting fee was paid out to SEV Enterprises, Solomon's company. It was enough to pay for the silver Lexus, the colonial house, and the emerald green silk dresses. It was enough to buy a life that looked perfect from the sidewalk. But money like that leaves a scent. I looked at the most recent outgoing wires. Leroy Monroe had been taking a 20% management fee. No wonder he was under investigation. He wasn't just a trustee, he was a parasite. I felt a cold, sharp prickle of satisfaction. Solomon thought he was the master of this inheritance. He didn't realize that as the legal widow of Elias Monroe, I had a claim to every cent of community property that had been illegally diverted. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't just a guest at his party. I was the owner of the house he was standing in. I picked up the burner phone. There was one saved message, dated 2 days before Elias's heart finally gave out. It was Solomon's voice. "Pop, Leroy says the feds are sniffing around the rail yard contracts. We need to move the files to the Sedona server. Call me when the coast is clear." He viewed his double life as a reckoning, a way to get even with a world that made him work for a living. He didn't see the irony that the only person he actually defeated was the woman who loved him. I didn't delete the message. I forwarded it to my private email. Then I spent the afternoon drafting a very specific gift for the anniversary party. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me that Solomon's entire lifestyle was a house built on a sinkhole. I just needed to be the one to pull the plug. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the study, I realized I wasn't tired. For the first time in months, the weight in my chest was gone. I wasn't mourning a man anymore. I was preparing to meet a ghost. If you had the power to empty the bank account of the person who betrayed you with one click, would you do it immediately, or would you wait until they were watching? Friday arrived with a heavy bruised purple sky that promised a storm, but I felt only the stillness of the eye. I spent the morning preparing. I went to the local print shop, the kind with the old, reliable machines that don't ask for a login or a cloud connection. I printed 20 copies of a single document, the birth certificate of Solomon Elias Monroe, paired with the marriage license of Elias and myself, dated 15 years before the boy was ever a thought. I tucked them into a series of elegant cream-colored envelopes. To the casual observer, they looked like cards of congratulations. To the recipient, they would be an obituary for a reputation. I spent the afternoon at the beauty parlor, not my usual spot where the ladies talk about their grandchildren's grades and the cost of eggs. I went to a high-end salon downtown where the air smells of expensive oils and silence is the primary service. I had my hair swept into a sharp architectural bun. I had my nails painted a deep obsidian black. When the stylist spun the chair around, I didn't see the woman who used to apologize for taking up space. I saw a woman who was about to occupy every square inch of a room. I drove back to the house on Elm Street one last time. I sat in the kitchen and looked at the chipped tile by the stove. I thought about the thousands of meals I'd cooked here, the thousands of times I'd wiped this counter while waiting for a man who was already home somewhere else. I felt no anger. Anger is a hot, wasteful thing. I felt only a cool, professional resolve. I checked the burner phone one last time. There was a new notification. A wire transfer had been initiated from the VV Holdings account, $200,000, labeled anniversary gift. I watched the green light of the security token pulse in my hand. With a few taps on my laptop, I intercepted the transfer. I didn't move it to my personal account. That would be theft. Instead, I moved it to a temporary escrow account held by a legal firm I'd contacted under a pseudonym. I flagged the funds as contested marital assets. The money didn't disappear, it just froze. It became a block of ice that Solomon wouldn't be able to melt without explaining exactly where the water came from. I looked at the clock. 6 p.m. The party would be starting soon. The Gilded Spoon would be serving hors d'oeuvres. The Monroe Foundation would be collecting checks for a future built on a past that was about to vanish. I put on the navy Chanel suit. I pinned a single vintage pearl brooch to my lapel, Elias's one and only gift to me that hadn't been bought with overtime money. It was real. It was small. It was enough. I didn't take my sedan. I called a car service. A black town car that looked like it belonged behind the gates of the house with the blue shutters. As we pulled away from the curb, I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, waving from her porch. She looked confused, seeing me in the back of a car that cost more than my house. I just nodded. The drive was quiet. I watched the city lights flicker past, a blur of gold and white against the rainy dark. I thought about Solomon. I wondered if he looked at his wife and felt the same hollowness Elias must have felt every time he walked through my door. Or perhaps he was more like his mother, the secretary who moved away. Perhaps he thought he had won. We turned into the cul-de-sac. The street was lined with luxury SUVs and sports cars. The house with the blue shutters was glowing, every window spilling light onto the manicured lawn. I could hear the faint, sophisticated thrum of a jazz trio playing on the patio. The driver opened my door. "Shall I wait, ma'am?" "No," I said, stepping onto the pavement. My heels made a sharp, final sound against the asphalt. I suspect I'll be staying for the entire performance. I walked toward the front door. Two young men in tuxedos stood at the entrance, holding clipboards. They looked at me, a dignified black woman in a suit that cost more than their education, and they didn't see a threat. They saw a donor. "Name, please," one asked, his pen poised. "I'm the guest of honor," I said, my voice as smooth as aged bourbon. "But you can put me down as the primary beneficiary." He frowned, scanning the list. Before he could find the discrepancy, I handed him one of the cream envelopes. Please, see that this gets to Mr. Monroe first. He's expecting a delivery regarding the Vengeance file. The boy's eyes widened at the name. He took the envelope and stepped aside. I walked into the foyer, the scent of lilies and expensive perfume hitting me like a wall. The party was in full swing. And there, in the center of the room, stood Solomon. He was holding a glass of champagne, laughing that same gravelly laugh that had led me here. The foyer of the house with the blue shutters was an exercise in stolen grandeur. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light over marble floors that had been polished until they were dangerously slick, much like the lives being lived on top of them. I stood at the edge of the great room, my navy suit a dark anchor in a sea of cocktail dresses and tailored tuxedos. No one looked at me with suspicion. To them, I was simply an elder, a matriarchal figure, whose presence added a layer of unearned tradition to the evening. Solomon was holding court near a grand piano, his hand resting on the small of Elena's back. She was draped in silk the color of a bruised plum, dripping in diamonds that I now recognized as line items from a ledger of diverted funds. They looked like a portrait of the American dream, provided you didn't look too closely at the canvas. I watched as the young man from the door approached a silver-haired man in the corner, Leroy Monroe. He was shorter than I imagined, with a nervous energy that he tried to mask with an expensive cigar and a loud, forced bark of a laugh. The boy handed him the cream envelope. I didn't look away. I wanted to see the exact microsecond the oxygen left his lungs. Leroy slid a manicured thumb under the seal. He pulled out the birth certificate. I saw his posture stiffen, a sudden, rigid alertness that made him look like a prey animal sensing a predator in the tall grass. He looked up, his eyes darting frantically around the room until they landed on me. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply held his gaze with the terrifying stillness of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to collect. He whispered something to a colleague and began weaving through the crowd towards Solomon. I moved too, but not toward them. I walked toward the buffet table, picking up a small silver fork and tapping it against a crystal water goblet. The sound was thin, sharp, and impossible to ignore. It cut through the jazz and the practiced laughter like a whistle in a graveyard. One by one, the conversations faltered. Heads turned. Solomon looked up, his brow furrowed in polite confusion. He didn't recognize me. Not yet. He only saw a guest who had taken liberties with the evening's schedule. "Good evening," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but I have spent decades projecting from a church pew. I know how to make a whisper carry to the back row. I hope I'm not interrupting the festivities. But it felt wrong to celebrate an anniversary without acknowledging the foundation upon which this entire house was built. Elena stepped forward, her smile tight and defensive. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met. Are you with the catering staff or perhaps the foundation board?" "I am the silent partner," I replied, stepping into the light. "The one who provided the capital for the Vengeance file. The one who stayed in a drafty house on Elm Street so that this patio could be heated. My name is Mrs. Elias Monroe, the only Mrs. Elias Monroe." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the marble. I saw the recognition hit Solomon like a physical blow. The glass in his hand tilted precariously. He looked at my face, the face of the woman his father had kissed goodbye every morning for 40 years, and he saw the end of his world. "Ma'am," Solomon stammered, his voice losing its polished edge. "This isn't the time or the place. We can talk in private." "Privacy is a luxury you've enjoyed for 38 years, Solomon," I said, my tone as calm as a frozen lake. "Tonight, we're practicing transparency. It's what your father would have wanted. After all, he kept such meticulous records." I saw Leroy Monroe trying to slip toward the hallway. Leroy, I called out, not turning my head. I wouldn't leave just yet. The car service I called for you isn't a town car. It's a government transport, and they're very sticklers for punctuality. The room erupted into a low, frantic murmur. Elena looked from Solomon to me, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified realization. She wasn't just losing a reputation. She was losing a lifestyle. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a small digital voice recorder. I pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Elias's voice, tired, ghostly, and indisputable, taken from a series of business memos he'd recorded on his burner phone. If the widow finds the Cayman routing, tell Monroe to liquidate the Sedona assets immediately. She's smarter than she looks, but she's loyal. She won't burn the house down while she's still living in it. I clicked it off. I looked around at the guests, the developers, the politicians, the socialites. They were already backing away from Solomon and Elena as if they were suddenly contagious. He was right about one thing, I said, looking directly at Solomon. I am loyal, but I don't live in that house anymore. I moved out the moment I realized I was the only thing in it that wasn't a lie. Solomon stepped toward me, his face contorting into a mask of desperate rage. You think you can just walk in here and take everything? My father built this for me. Your father built this with my life. I corrected him. And as for taking everything, I already have. The accounts were frozen 2 hours ago. The Sedona property is under a legal lien, and the IRS is currently opening the vengeance file in a room much less comfortable than this one. I felt a strange, quiet peace. The house with the blue shutters was still standing, but the foundation had already turned to dust. The silence that follows a confession is never truly silent. It's filled with the sound of shifting feet, the rustle of silk, and the collective indrawn breath of 50 people realizing they are standing in a crime scene. Solomon's face had gone from a healthy bronze to a sickly, ashen gray. He looked at the guests, his peers, his investors, his neighbors, and saw them retreating. In high society, scandal is a stain, but federal involvement is a plague. This is a mistake, Solomon whispered, though his voice cracked, betraying the terror beneath the bravado. My father, he had business interests, legitimate ones. You're a bitter woman who was left behind, and now you're trying to tear down what you couldn't build. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I didn't tear it down. Solomon. I simply turned on the lights. Termites don't like the sun. I turned my gaze to Elena. She was clutching her pearls so tightly I thought the string might snap. She wasn't a villain in this story, not really. She was just a woman who had accepted a beautiful life without asking where the receipts were. Elena, dear, I said softly, the emerald dress is lovely. I hope you kept the tags. You'll find that when the government seizes assets purchased with commingled funds, they don't care about the fashion season. You can't do this, she stammered, her eyes darting to Leroy Monroe, who was now sweating through his custom-tailored shirt. Leroy, tell her. The trust is protected. Leroy didn't say a word. He was too busy staring at the door. He knew that if I was here, the vengeance file wasn't just a threat, it was an indictment. He slipped his phone from his pocket, likely trying to delete messages or alert a lawyer, but I saw his hand trembling. The trust was built on a foundation of diverted pension funds from the rail yard, I said, addressing the room at large. Funds meant for men and women who worked 30 years in the heat and the cold, only to find their retirement accounts mysteriously underperforming. While they were clipping coupons, Solomon was buying Sedona sunsets. A murmur rippled through the crowd. These were wealthy people, yes, but many of them were self-made. The idea of a man stealing from his own labors to fund a secret dynasty was a transgression even they couldn't stomach. Solomon stepped toward me, his hands balled into fists. Get out. Get out of my house before I have you removed. Your house? I tilted my head. The deed for 412 Blue Shutter Lane is held by VV Holdings as the primary beneficiary of the Elias Monroe estate, and given that the corporation was funded entirely with marital assets hidden during our 40-year union, I filed an emergency injunction this afternoon. Technically, Solomon, you are trespassing on my property. I pulled a folded document from my suit pocket, the court-stamped injunction, and laid it on the grand piano. It sat there, a white rectangular tombstone for his ambitions. I've spent 40 years being patient. I continued, walking toward the large glass doors that led to the patio. I waited for a man who was already gone. I saved pennies while he spent thousands. I thought I was building a legacy of quiet dignity, but I realized that dignity without truth is just a well-dressed lie. I looked out at the garden. The caterers were frozen by the buffet, silver trays hovering in midair. The jazz trio had stopped playing. The only sound was the distant siren of a police cruiser, still blocks away, but drawing closer with every heartbeat. I had timed it perfectly. The anonymous tip regarding Leroy Monroe's whereabouts had been delivered with surgical precision. Solomon looked at the document on the piano, then back at me. For a second, I saw the boy he must have been, the secret child raised on the promise of a kingdom he didn't earn. There was a hollow desperation in his eyes that almost made me feel pity. Almost. What do you want? He hissed, leaning in so the guests couldn't hear. Money? You want a settlement? Name your price and go. I don't want your money, Solomon, I whispered back, my eyes locking onto his. I want the 40 years back. But since you can't give me those, I'll settle for watching you learn how to live without them. I turned away from him and walked toward the foyer. The guests parted like the Red Sea. No one tried to stop me. No one offered a hand. I was a ghost they were finally seeing in the daylight, and ghosts are best left alone. As I reached the front door, the first blue and red lights began to dance against the white colonial columns. The theater was over. The audit had begun. The flashing lights outside the house with the blue shutters weren't just a signal for Leroy Monroe. They were a herald for the end of a long, expensive dream. I stood on the top step of the porch, my navy suit crisp against the humid night air, watching as 3 dark sedans pulled into the circular driveway. Men in windbreakers with yellow lettering stepped out, not local police, but federal agents. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I simply stood there like a gargoyle on a cathedral, watching the architecture of a lie crumble in real time. Behind me, the party had devolved into a frantic, hushed exodus. Guests were slipping out through the side gardens, their designer heels sinking into the soft, overwatered turf. They didn't want to be interviewed. They didn't want their names in a ledger that was currently being uploaded to a government server. Solomon appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, his eyes wild with the realization that he couldn't charm his way out of a forensic audit. He looked at the agents, then at me. You called them. He hissed, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and disbelief. You actually called them on your own husband's legacy. I didn't call them on a legacy, Solomon. I said, my voice steady and cold. I called them on a crime. Your father spent 40 years telling me we were comfortable. He didn't tell me we were comfortable because he was stealing the futures of the men he worked beside. That's not a legacy. That's a debt. The lead agent, a woman with a sharp bob and a clipboard that looked like a weapon, walked up the steps. She nodded to me, a brief professional acknowledgement of the anonymous source who had provided the encryption keys to the VV Holdings server. Mr. Solomon Monroe, she asked, her voice echoing in the marble foyer. And Mr. Leroy Monroe? We have warrants for the seizure of all records pertaining to the Vengeance file and the Sedona transfers. I watched Leroy Monroe try to blend into the shadows of the coat closet. It was a pathetic sight, a man who had spent his life managing millions, now trying to hide behind a rack of cashmere coats. The agents found him in seconds. Elena came out then, her emerald dress trailing on the floor. She wasn't crying. She looked hollow. She looked at the house, the crystal, the art, the polished wood. And I saw the moment she realized none of it belonged to her. It never had. It belonged to the widows of the rail yard workers who had died without their full pensions. It belonged to me. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and brittle. "Now," I said, stepping down the first stair, "the math begins. Every dinner, every vacation, every diamond, it all gets subtracted. You'll find that when you live on stolen time, the interest is a bitter thing to pay." I walked past the agents and toward the black town car. I had kept waiting. I didn't look back at the house. I knew what it looked like. A beautiful shell with nothing inside but the echoes of a man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. As the car pulled away, I looked at my reflection in the window. I looked tired, but for the first time in months, my eyes were clear. I wasn't the grieving widow anymore. I wasn't the woman waiting for a phone call. That would never come. I was the auditor of my own life. I reached into my bag and pulled out the burner phone. I deleted the forwarded messages. I deleted the account logins. I didn't need them anymore. The truth was out in the world now, and the truth is a self-sustaining fire. We drove back toward the city, toward the modest house on Elm Street. It was small, it was old, and the porch still needed paint. But as we turned onto my street, I realized that for the first time in 40 years, the air inside that house would be clean. I had spent my life building a home for a man who lived in a palace of secrets. Tonight, I was going home to a house that was finally mine, not because Elias left it to me, but because I was the only one left standing when the lies ran out of breath. The drive back to Elm Street felt longer than the trip to the party, though the miles remained the same. My driver was silent, a professional witness to a woman who had just set her husband's second life on fire and didn't bother to look back at the smoke. I sat in the plush leather seat, my hands folded over the navy silk of my skirt. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. I felt the deep, bone-weary satisfaction of a long day's work finally coming to an end. When I stepped onto my porch, the wood groaned under my weight, a familiar, honest sound. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The smell of the house hit me, lemon wax, old books, and the faint, lingering ghost of Elias's peppermint. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a storage unit for a woman who had been kept in the dark. I went straight to the kitchen. I stripped off the Chanel jacket, hanging it over the back of a wooden chair. I rolled up my sleeves and began to boil water for tea. While the kettle started its low, mournful whistle, I pulled out my laptop one last time. The Vengeance file was no longer just a digital ghost. As of 20 minutes ago, the federal agents had successfully mirrored the server in Sedona. I watched the remote access logs on my screen as they moved through the folders, each one a different year of our marriage. 1988, General Logistics. 1995, Rail Yard Maintenance Overages. 2004, Cayman Diversion. Elias had been so proud of his organization. He had mapped out his betrayals with the precision of a master architect, but he had forgotten the most basic rule of accounting. The numbers always have to balance. You cannot subtract 40 years from a woman's life without leaving a deficit that eventually has to be settled. I saw a new alert on the banking portal. Solomon had tried to access a secondary emergency fund, a small, 5-figure account held in a local branch. The screen flashed red, account frozen by judicial order. I could almost see him standing at an ATM or staring at his phone in the back of a government car, realizing that the golden faucet had finally run dry. He had never worked a day in his life without his father's stolen safety net beneath him. Tonight, he was learning the hard way what gravity feels like when the net is cut. The kettle shrieked. I poured the water over a tea bag, watching the dark amber liquid swirl and cloud. I thought about Martha Jean Sinclair. I wondered if she had loved Elias, or if she had simply loved the lifestyle he provided for her and her son. Did she know about the house on Elm Street? Did she know about the woman who mended his socks while he was buying her diamonds? Or were we both just lines on a ledger to him? Assets to be managed, liabilities to be mitigated? I realized it didn't matter. Martha Jean was a ghost of the past, and I was the reality of the present. I took my tea into the living room and sat in the dark. I didn't turn on the lamps. I wanted to see the moon through the curtains. I thought about the families of the rail yard workers. Tomorrow, I would be calling a very specific law firm, one that specialized in class action suits for pension fraud. I had the names. I had the amounts. I had the proof of where their money had gone. I wasn't just going to take the money for myself. That would be a different kind of theft. I was going to ensure that the Monroe Foundation actually did some good for the people Elias had stepped on to build it. I would be the chairwoman of that liquidation. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from an unknown number. Please, don't do this to Elena. She didn't know anything. I'll give you whatever you want. Just stop the audit. I didn't reply. I didn't even delete it. I just looked at it. Solomon still thought this was a negotiation. He still thought everything had a price. He didn't understand that some things, like 40 years of a woman's trust, don't have a sticker price. They have a consequence. I sipped my tea. It was hot bitter and exactly what I needed. Tomorrow, the headlines would break. Tomorrow, the Monroe name would be dragged through the mud of the very city Elias thought he had conquered. Tomorrow, the house with the blue shutters would be an evidence locker. But tonight, the house on Elm Street was quiet, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. The morning sun didn't struggle to break through the clouds. It arrived with a sharp, clinical brightness that exposed every speck of dust in the house on Elm Street. I sat at the kitchen table, dressed not in Chanel, but in a simple cotton robe. I was drinking a second cup of tea and watching the local news. The headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen in a frantic red. Local philanthropist Solomon Monroe and trustee Leroy Monroe detained in federal fraud investigation. There was a helicopter shot of the house with the blue shutters. From that height, the pool looked like a tiny sapphire, and the silver Lexus looked like a toy discarded on a sidewalk. I saw agents carrying boxes, my boxes, out of the front door. I saw Elena, her face shielded by a silk scarf, being led to a car. She looked small, without the pedestal of Elias's money. She was just another woman discovering that the floor had been pulled out from under her. My phone rang. It was the lawyer I'd contacted, a woman named Sarah, who specialized in uncovering the unrecoverable. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, her voice sounding impressed. "The forensic team just finished a preliminary sweep of the VV Holdings server. It's a roadmap. Your husband didn't just hide money. He kept a diary of every bribe, every diverted pension, and every offshore transfer. It's going to take years to untangle, but the short version, the Monroe Foundation, is effectively a shell for money laundering. And the workers," I asked, "the men from the rail yard?" "We've already flagged the diverted pension accounts. Under the emergency injunction you filed, those funds are being moved into a protected trust for the original beneficiaries. It won't bring back the years they spent struggling, but it will ensure their grandchildren don't have to." "Good," I said. "And the house? For 12 Blue Shutter Lane. It's being appraised for liquidation. Since it was purchased with marital assets that were never disclosed in your joint filings, the court is granting you 70% of the sale price as a primary victim of financial fraud. The rest goes into the Victim Restitution Fund." I hung up the phone and looked out the window. A blue jay was pecking at the bird feeder I'd forgotten to fill. I realized that for 40 years, I had been the one being managed. I had been a line item in Elias's budget, a fixed cost that required a certain amount of maintenance to keep the machine running. He thought he was the CEO of our life, and I was just the staff. He had underestimated the most dangerous person in his world, the one who saw everything and said nothing. I stood up and walked to the hallway. I took the portrait of Elias off the wall, the one where he was wearing his foreman's jacket, looking proud and unbreakable. I didn't smash it. I didn't burn it. I simply walked it out to the alley and leaned it against the trash bin. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who thought he was cleverer than the truth. I returned to the house and felt a lightness in my chest that had nothing to do with forgiveness. It was the feeling of a closed ledger. The debt was paid. The accounts were balanced. The vengeance file was finally closed. I sat on my porch and watched a neighbor walk her dog. She waved, and I waved back. She didn't know that the quiet woman in the house on the corner had just dismantled a criminal empire before breakfast. She didn't need to know. The most effective power is the kind that doesn't need an audience to be felt. Elias had wanted a legacy that lived in the dark. I gave him one that burned in the light. True power isn't found in the noise of a confrontation. It's found in the silence of a calculated move. If you've learned anything from my story, let it be this. Never mistake a woman's patience for her weakness. She isn't just waiting for the storm to pass. She's deciding when it starts. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to Vintage Vengeance and share this video with someone who needs to remember their own strength. Justice isn't always fast, but when a woman like me is keeping the books, it is always inevitable.